welcome to all of you to this virtual event, the January meeting of our ROAAR Book Club. My name is Jacqueline Sundberg, and I work with the ROAAR group here at the library. That stands for Rare Books and Special Collections, the Osler Library of the History of Medicine, Visual Arts Collection, and Archives and Records Management. For today's ROAAR Book Club, we're looking beyond the book, beyond print, even beyond paper. Today we are looking at textiles and textile artworks through the eyes of a curator. Our guest today is Deborah Goodman Davis, and we're going to be looking at weaving words and textiles, a conversation with a curator. So once again, welcome. A few housekeeping notes to start us off, and then I will pass the microphone to Nathalie Cooke for some opening comments. Today, I'm joining you from McGill's downtown campus, and this place is located on land that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange for Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. ROAAR honors, recognizes, and respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which I, for my part, am meeting with all of you today. So we want to really welcome you all into this tradition of exchanging of ideas. We have a bit of a non-traditional book club. We didn't all read the same edition or volume or novel and then come together to talk about it. But our book club isn't a book club of ideas. So thank you for joining this tradition of exchange of ideas. Now I'll pass the microphone to Nathalie Cooke, who's going to open with some comments. Nathalie is professor of English here at McGill and the Associate Dean of ROAAR.
Thanks so much, Jacqueline. You know what, it's a genuine pleasure today to welcome today's guest, whom I know actually, and to open up a conversation on the topic of textiles and word weaving. One of the strengths of the ROAAR collection, the capital A of which represents the visual arts collection here at McGill, is the diverse nature of those collections. In addition to the core collections of books and manuscripts and archival materials, we do have indeed some remarkable, unique textile items like tapestries, puppets, and non-textual objects in the ROAAR holdings, as well as on display actually across the campus here at McGill. Today's conversations will explore the overlap of a few of those categories. Now, we have some exciting news as of the beginning of this week. Our ROAAR reading room is once again open for booked appointments, and we look forward to welcoming you back to in-person events in the not so distant future. Thank you all for sharing your time and for being part of the community and joining the ROAAR Book Club conversation, albeit from a distance today. On that note, I just want to mention a few thanks to those who make our events possible. I'd like to thank our sponsors and donors who make the work of putting on events such as this one possible at all. Our thanks to the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada for ongoing support, and also to very generous private donors, Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley. Now, let me introduce to you Wendy Owens, who is director of our visual arts collection at ROAAR. Her work has spotlighted such artists as Gordon Matter Clark, Morris Prendergast, Lauren Harris, and David Mill, and most recently, Marion Scott. Wendy is director of our visual arts collection, and we are thrilled to be working with her and always enjoy her conversations when she's animating items in our art collection, as well as engaging with those in the community. Please enjoy the conversation with Debbie Goodman Davis today, whom I think Wendy first met a few years ago now at Cornell, when they collaborated together. And I suspect at some point that might come up in the conversation. So welcome, Debbie, and I'll turn it over to you now, Wendy.
Thank you, Nathalie. It's great to be here. And yes, when I do my introduction to Debbie in a couple of minutes, there is a connection. So I will talk a little bit about that. But since we're talking about textiles, I thought I would do a little bit of a brief background and refresher for all of you. So I'm going to share my screen. So when we talk about textiles and textile art, it's a very broad category. So this is going to be just a real rush through a little bit of history. And there we are. So when I talk about textiles, I always talk about the Tapestry of the Apocalypse, which is a very early surviving textile in Angers, France, which tells the story of Revelation. And it has these wonderful, wonderful panels with complex backgrounds and figures. And this is the New Jerusalem. And it's remarkable that this has survived, because one of the things that happened with textiles is over time, they stopped being important to people. And in the same city, there is a museum of textiles that was founded by Jean Lucas, who is the person who's responsible for reviving an interest in textiles in the 20th century. And what came about were people like Pierre Matisse, who got interested in making textiles. And much like before, very often the artist who would do the textile would actually not weave it. Professional weavers would weave the textiles. And as we think about it in the 20th century, the great thing about textiles in the Middle Ages, they were very important for warmth as well as for decoration. In the 20th century, when you get to different kinds of spaces, they look fabulous in big open spaces. This is at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas. And you're looking at modern works of art commissioned from artists who are that were then woven by professionals. And bringing this closer to home, McGill has quite a wonderful collection of textiles, and they serve a wonderful purpose of enlivening spaces. You're looking at a rather dull conference room that has a marvelous textile designed by artist Stuart Davis. The other thing that textiles do is they buffer the sound. So this is a textile by artist Dorothy Knowles, and it was purchased to buffer sound in a space in the Faculty of Music. Here's a large textile by Micheline Beauchemin, a Quebec artist, that is on view in the Canadian Architectural Collection. Some of the textiles are indeed very large and really change a space that would otherwise be pretty uninteresting. We recently installed many textiles in the library. You're seeing the library as it looked in COVID, without a lot of people. We look forward to a moment when everyone will be back at their desks in the library. And then any discussion of textiles in the collection at McGill is incomplete without a mention of this textile by the artist Roy Lichtenstein. It's in the Arts Building. Most of the pictures we have of this textile have people in front of it because it's in a busy hallway and people are always rushing back and forth. But I find when I speak to graduates of McGill, they all remember this textile. The other thing with textiles for public spaces is they're not completely indestructible, but almost. They can be cleaned, they can be moved, we can roll them up. So that works in terms of a big public art collection. And you'll notice that a number of these are a gift of Regina Slatkin. Regina Slatkin, McGill 1929, became an art dealer in New York. She and her husband ran a business that connected artists with makers and produced many, many extraordinary tapestries. Also, just to show you, tapestries that we have are not just enormous. Some of them are small. This is a tapestry by artist Nancy Kyle that I particularly enjoy. And then a sort of preview of what we're talking about in terms of exhibitions and textiles. They have been in many buildings, but it's been a long time since we've seen textile exhibitions, except in 2019 at the Beckler Museum in Charlotte, North Carolina. There was an exhibition, Nomadic Murals, Tapestries of the Modern Era, and you're looking at one from our collection by Frank Stella. When the organizers of this exhibition got busy and found us, they were delighted. We sent 4 different works to the exhibition. And I recently discovered that the Museum of Modern Art, which all tells us what to do and what to like, has recently done a textile exhibition. This is from MoMA in 2019. On the left, you're seeing a large textile by Le Corbusier. Finally, I'm going to end with a different kind of textile. This is a farmer's coat from Japan, and I'm going to show you a detail. It's a marvelous example of recycling, using old fabrics to make an extraordinary object. And it is about to go on view in the library. And the other thing, for those of you who follow the Visual Arts Collection and know about our De-Stress initiative, this is the De-Stress work for next week. So people who get our email will have an opportunity to see this work, and we encourage you to draw it and send us back your interpretations. So with that, I'm going to switch gears and introduce Debbie Goodman Davis. And as Nathalie hinted, Debbie and I know each other from many years ago. She was an intern when I ran the internship program at Cornell University. And of course, I was very young when I did that. And she's a great example of what happens to interns. They go on and have wonderful careers. So she's now an art advisor and a curator who helps her clients to build quality collections of contemporary art and photography. She's a native of Montreal, and she has now over 30 years experience in the art world, beginning with a summer internship at the Museum of Fine Arts here in Montreal. And she's worked at the Art Institute of Chicago, Yale University Art Gallery, and of course, the Herbert F. Johnson Museum of Art and Sotheby's in London. She's also a writer. Her 2012 children's book, Speeding Down the Spiral, an artful adventure about a family's trip to the Guggenheim Museum, received the Mom's Choice Silver Medal Prize. I bought it and gave it to a small child. It's a great book. She also edited Photo RX, Pharmacy in Photography since 1850, a catalog dedicated to the photography collection of Pharmascience in 2017. She chairs the Friends of Photography Acquisitions Committee and is a member of the Advisory Council of the Herbert F. Johnson Museum of Art at Cornell. She serves on the Humanities Council at the University of Chicago and chairs the Contemporary Arts Acquisitions Committee and is a board member of the American Friends of the Israel Museum. And she, as I mentioned, she studied at Cornell University. She also has an MA from the University of Chicago, and both her degrees are in art history. And she and I have stayed in touch, and I was very excited when I got a video online of the exhibition that she's going to tell us about today. So over to you, Debbie.
Debbie, you just need to unmute.
Okay, everybody can hear me?
Looks great.
Hopefully you can see.
Yeah.
unmute myself. Okay, you can see me. Wendy, thank you for that lovely introduction. And I have to say, I was so honored that you asked me to talk about my show because of our history. And I, will always look up to you because you hired me as an intern, and it was such a meaningful, for me, it just meant so much that someone acknowledged that, chose me because it was competitive, and that it made me realize that I would be able to have a career, that I loved working in the arts. So this is very meaningful to me. And of course, that I'm a Montrealer and my whole family went to McGill. So I'm really delighted to be here. And it's a great opportunity for me to get to relive this exhibition that I curated that in the fall of 2021, that it could have been forgotten, but now we're going to talk about it again. And as everybody mentioned, it's called Textiles, the Woven Word, and it's about fiber arts, textile arts that include language. So, oh, why isn't it advancing? Oh, there we go. So the exhibition took place at Bookstein Projects. It's a gallery on the Upper East Side in New York City, and the gallery is in a brownstone. And it's just, it's a lovely gallery, but it's small. It's one room. So we're looking at here, the right side of the room. And here is the left side of the room. And the wall that we're not seeing is a wall of windows that overlooks like the tree-lined street at 66th Street. And I just wanted to show you a few smaller scale works, but we're going to go through the whole show, one work by work. So the genesis of the exhibition was this quilt by Gina Adams. Gina Adams is an American artist who actually lives in Vancouver. She teaches art at Emily Carr University. And I love her work, and she's not that well known. And I had approached the owner of the gallery, Lori Bookstein, about having a show of Gina's quilts. And because the gallery is so small, it wasn't going to work. But that was the genesis for this idea of looking into textile art with text. So I'm going to this is a professional picture, but I sort of think my iPhone pictures give you a better idea of the texture of the work. So Gina Adams has a very interesting background. Her stepfather, whose name she has, Adams, is a descendant of John Adams and John Quincy Adams, so founding fathers of the United States. But her grandfather was Native American. So she's very interested in this hybrid identity that she has, and that's what she really addresses in her art. And so this quilt is from an ongoing series called Broken Treaty Quilts. So why Broken Treaty Quilts? Because the American government, and I think the British government too, had over 370 treaties with the Native Americans, all of which were broken. So Gina is going through the treaties one by one, making these quilts. I selected this quilt because the treaty with the Seneca Nation from 1802, I just think it's a very beautiful quilt. Gina did not make the quilt. The quilt is a vintage quilt, and everything about this work sort of brings you back to this vintage feeling of the time that the treaty was written. So Gina looks for antique quilts that were made close to the time of the treaty. What Gina has done is she has taken excerpts from the text of the treaty, and she's cut out the letters out of calico cotton. So they're all hand cut out and hand sewn onto the existing quilt. And you can see the font that she's chosen is a font that was very popular at the time in newsprint. It would have been seen everywhere. And then the choice of calico cotton is interesting because calico was a popular fabric at the time, but also calico, the cotton, was a huge American export to Europe. They made a lot of money off this cotton. And of course, where was the cotton made? The cotton was grown on the plantations that were worked by slaves. So there are many layers of meaning in this work. Now, when you walk into the gallery, what you face is this side of the quilt. And this is really the back of Gina's quilt, although they're really, you're supposed to walk around them, but you don't see the title on this side. But this is really the front of the quilt, with all the beautiful pattern and design on it. But you can see that Gina has still applied the text on this side. It's very difficult to read because it's conflicting with the pattern. But what Gina's trying to get reinforced is the idea that these treaties were intentionally written to be deceptive and cryptic. And sometimes there were even translators, that weren't even translating them properly to the Native Americans. So it's just a sort of a beautiful way of telling a very devastating story about our history. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about text art and textile art very, very quickly. Text in art is really a 20th century phenomenon. A text has existed in art before, and the greatest example I can think about is medieval illuminated manuscripts. But really, text starts to appear in painting and in the beginning of the 20th century with Cubism and Dada and Surrealism. And on the upper left, we're looking at a collage by Picasso where he has cut out pages from the newspaper, and he actually has the word journal on there. And so this is really the beginnings of text in art. And then if you look on the upper right, the famous painting by Magritte, Ceci n'est pas une pipe, this is not a pipe, meaning that this is a representation of a pipe. And then fast forwarding to the second half of the 20th century, text starts to appear on its own in art. And this is the beginning of the conceptual art movement and minimalism. And we're looking at a painting by Ed Ruscha, and all you have is color, text, and paint. And now when you go to when you go to, let's say, an art fair, you look around and there is text everywhere. Artists are making text neon signs, they're doing murals. It's just ubiquitous. And just giving an example of one contemporary artist who I really love, Glenn Ligon. He's an African-American artist, and all of his work is text-based. So now on to the textiles. Textile art is ancient. People have been weaving since the beginning of time, but textile arts have always been considered at a different level than the fine arts, such as painting, sculpture, printmaking, drawing, even photography. Textile art has been considered craft and women's work and folk art. And the picture on the upper left is showing you the women weavers at the Bauhaus school in Germany that existed between the two world wars. Was a very innovative and important art school. And one of the things that they did is they brought together architects and painters and sculptors, and also the applied arts like weaving. But unfortunately, the women artists who attended the school were discouraged from attending painting classes and encouraged from attending the weaving classes. So here is this picture of a lot of the women posing at their loom. And below that is a picture of Annie Albers, who was a student at the Bauhaus and was one of the greatest weavers of the 20th century. And her work was so exquisite and brilliant that she really elevated weaving to sort of a higher realm, to be taken more seriously by the art world. Today, I've noticed, again, I'm an art advisor. I'm out looking at contemporary art all the time, and I am seeing so much textile art now. And it's showing up, hanging in museums now. Young artists are choosing to major in art school, in fiber arts. There is this resurgence. And I think one of the main reason for this is that we're living in a digital revolution, and everything is digital and fast and not handmade. And I think that there's a real yearning to return to the handmade and to really the old-fashioned ways of doing things. And we're also living through very trying times, and working with your hands is a calming thing. It's very meditative. So I don't know, that's what I'm thinking. And now I just wanted to give you a few examples of the combination of text and textiles, because that's what this show is about. And going all the way back to medieval times, and it was very rare to have text and textiles, but these are the Bayeux Tapestries. This is about the Norman conquest of England, and it's an enormous embroidery that like goes circle when it's in Normandy in a museum, and it takes over a whole room. And you can see the Latin text that's helping to explain the narrative. And then below that is something more recent. It's a sampler from the 18th century, and in Europe and in America, all young women were, what part of their education was to learn how to embroider. And this is how they would hone their skills. So here you see the combination of learning to learn letters and also make images. So onto my show. We had 2 quilts in the show. This is the second quilt. It's by Jeffrey Gibson. Jeffrey Gibson lives in upstate New York. He is Native American. And he also has an interesting background because his father was in the military. So he grew up on military bases in Korea and in Germany. And in addition, he got his master's in fine arts in London. And Jeffrey looks at his heritage, and he always really is using something that's reminiscent of Native American artworks, crafts, the materials that they use, but he is making his work extremely open, universal, and very contemporary, bringing, Western art together with Native American ideas. And he often uses text, and this quilt is called Hope, Need, Want, and it's asking, what do all people hope, need, and want to achieve happiness? And you can see that he has scattered there the words "speak to me so that I can understand," and the pronouns he, him, she, me. Jeffrey's work is about his identity, not only being Native American, but he is gay. And I think there's a lot about communication and understanding. And this is like a quilt I've never seen. He calls them crazy quilts. And the fabrics, when he decided he wanted to quilt, because he works in all different media, this is a new thing for him. He wanted to find fabrics. He couldn't find anything he liked. He realized he had these fantastic scraps in his own studio. So these are fabrics that he silk screen onto. In some cases, he silk screen images of his own work. And another interesting thing about this quilt is that Jeffrey didn't make it. He works with a quilter, and the quilter, his name is Robert Bemis, and he's a man. So we always think of quilts as being women's work, but now men are making quilts too. And this quilter is extremely, extremely skilled. I wish that you can be in front of it and you could touch it, because I'm sure this is the back of it, by the way. And so Robert traced everything that is on the front in thread, and it comes through on the back, and you can see these beautiful arabesque lines. And what you can't see on this slide is the density that the sewing has created. There's like this energy that emanates from the quilt. It's really an extraordinary work. So now this next artist is Marie Watt. Marie Watt is also Native American. She lives in Portland. She got her master's in fine arts at Yale. And Marie is interested in the blanket. And this is a fragment of a blanket. and it's a used blanket. People give her blankets. For her, the blanket has many meanings. For universally, we are all, it represents the cycle of life. We're all born wrapped in a blanket. We spend our lives covered in a blanket at night sleeping, and then we die wrapped in a blanket. For Native Americans, if you wrap someone in a blanket, it's a way of honoring them. Deals are sealed upon presenting a blanket. And then there's the very unfortunate history of the settlers giving blankets to the Native Americans with smallpox. So there are many layers of meanings with the blanket. And then the letters on here, or the wording, proto, the letters are sewn on with glass check beads, which you can't really see how beautiful they are. They maybe even crystal. They have this beautiful sparkle to them. And of course, beading was a way Native American women were able to support their families. So there's that meaning to it. And what does proto mean? Well, Marie grew up in the Seneca Nation, and it's a matrilineal society. And she says she was always confused about feminism and really didn't understand what people were talking about till she got to college, because in the way she grew up, women have all of the control. They decide who about the land. They choose who the chief is going to be. And so she thinks of her people as being proto, before feminist, really proto. So she's talking about proto-feminism in this work. So now we're going back in time. We've been looking at very contemporary works. This is an embroidery from 1990, and this is by Alighiero Boetti. So Boetti is no longer alive. He was part of the Arte Povera movement, a conceptual art movement in Italy. And already it's very interesting, and he's a beloved artist. This is, people love his work. We got so many emails about, people wanting to know if this was available, because these works are very sought after in the art market. But it's interesting that in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a man was making artwork that was embroidery. And this sort of, because it wasn't a woman making it, it elevates in people, collectors' minds, that it sort of has a higher status, unfortunately. But so this is called an arazzi. Boetti, as I said, was Italian. Arazzi means tapestry, and they always have a text in them, and the text reads top to bottom, left to right. So excuse my bad Italian, but it says essere sulla cresta della onda, being at the top of the wave, being ahead of your time. And Boetti in 1971 traveled to Afghanistan, and this is before the Russians had invaded, before the US was there. And he fell in love with Afghanistan. He had a hotel there, and he made friends. And the friends had wives who were embroiderers. And for 30 years, he began this relationship with indirectly. He wasn't able to deal with the women directly, but through the husbands, and he paid these women to make his tapestries. And at the beginning, he always made the drawing, the text was his, and he would specify very directly about the colors and instructions. But the relationship went on for so long that there was so much trust that the women were able to have artistic license. And they, in the later years, they were all choosing their own colors. And you could probably tell if you see a lot of them, which woman did which embroideries. So now moving forward again, Elaine Rychek is a New York artist. She is in her 80s. She, like Marie Watt, got her master's in fine art at Yale in the 70s, and she was a painting major. And this was like the height of the feminist movement. And she gets her degree, and she says, as a political statement, I am going to embroider. I am not going to paint. And all her friends said to her, are you crazy? This is a career killer. You'll never sell a work. And she has been embroidering her whole career. And I'm just going to advance to this. This is an earlier work. And when she first started, she was making these samplers, but she sort of reinvented the sampler. And if you look closely on the bottom left, there's a quote from Barbara Kruger, I shop, therefore I am, a great conceptual artist who works in text. And then if you look on the right, she snuck in there a line by Jenny Holzer, abuse of power comes as no surprise. You could see that also Jenny is a text-based artist. And so very political works. Going back to the work on our show, so here, Elaine has been working on a series on literature and also invisibility. And this is, so here, and this is very painstaking, slow work. And I have to add that when Elaine started embroidering, she didn't know how. She had to teach herself how. She didn't learn it from her mother. And so this is a poem by George Eliot. George Eliot, who wrote one of the greatest novels of the 19th century, Middlemarch, who of course published under a pseudonym because she was really Marianne Evans, but had she tried to publish as Marianne Evans, she may not have been taken as seriously. And this is a poem about the afterlife. And you can see that Elaine has recreated the piece of paper, and the handwriting is actually the Palmer method, the way from the 19th century to the 60s, children learned how to write cursive. All these things are disappearing in our digital age. So looking at that, this is a picture of Elaine at our show. And you can see she's holding a flashlight up to the work because that white thread that made the lines of the paper is actually glow in the dark. Why is this? Well, the poem is about the afterlife and invisibility, and Elaine is making the invisible visible. But also, I believe that it's referencing our digital age and the glow of the computer screen, and that this work is about handwriting on paper, and it sort of makes sense to me that there's another meaning to that. So this is a work by Ghada Mer. Ghada lives in New York, but she's Egyptian, and she grew up in France. Her father was a diplomat, and she got her master's in fine art at a school in Nice. And there was one painting professor in the school, and he wouldn't allow women in his classes. So Ghada said, well, to hell with this. I am never going to paint. And she starts embroidering. And Ghada knew how to embroider because her mother and her grandmother had taught her how to embroider. But the early works that Ghada was making were of these erotic images of women that she took out of pornographic magazines. This is a work with no imagery. This is a completely text-based work. I completely love this work. It's called Blackboard with Grid. And so you can see it's a canvas that's been painted with black paint. And then she has sewn in white thread. It's hard to see because there are a lot of layers, but you could see there's a white grid. And over the grid, she has embroidered a text which says, I am tough, I am ambitious, and I know exactly what I want. And if that makes me a bitch, okay. And then it repeats itself. And of course, it's very difficult to read this because she has made this extraordinary thread drawing. She left the ends of the thread really long, and she made this like Jackson Pollock-y kind of thread drawing on the surface. So it's hard to read, but it's just great work. Here is work by Jessica Rankin. So Ghada is in her 50s. Jessica is in her 40s. Jessica is an Australian artist, but she lives in New York. And Jessica has always been interested in thread, and her early works were just embroidery. But lately she's become interested in painting with thread and sort of questioning or breaking down the hierarchy between paint and fiber. And it's hard for you to see. It's even hard if you were in front of it in the gallery, but she's playing tricks with you because part of those lines, some of those lines are paint and some of those lines are thread. You can see on the bottom, you can see, sort of see the texture of the blue thread, but then it turns into blue paint. The most exciting part of this painting are the sides, and that's where the text appears. And Jessica is an avid reader of poetry, and she keeps journals of her favorite poems. This is actually not a quote from poetry, but from the French feminist post-structuralist. Her name is Hélène Cixous, and it says, "Elsewhere, outside," which is interesting to me because when you think about, she puts her text on the margins on the outside, and think about fiber arts being on the outside too, and of course women artists. And I hope you could see in the slide that the sides are completely embroidered. And and one of the things she's trying to do is treat paint like thread and thread like paint. So I think that seeing it from the side really gives you that, makes it a little clearer. This is by Zoe Buckman. This is a vintage tea towel, so making a feminist statement about women's work. And the text embroidered on it is, "It stings, I sob, it stings, I sob, it stings, I sob, it stings." And so Zoe is British. Her mother was Jenny Buckman, who was a prominent feminist playwright. And one of her plays, she wrote about getting her period for the first time with no explanation. Nobody had warned her. And she tried to clean her body and her clothes with bleach. And but also another layer of meaning is that in this is that Zoe had lost her mother that year. So after sitting with this for a few weeks, it suddenly dawned on me that it was also about the pain of losing her mother. And Zoe was one of the younger artists in the show. She's in her mid-30s. So this is a work by Erin Riley. Erin is the same age as Zoe, so our younger artists in the show. Erin is a rising star. She lives in New York. She is a weaver. She got her master's in fiber arts. She only weaves, but she's weaving. And so this is a tapestry, and this is her subject matter is extremely contemporary. So she'll weave screenshots of herself, and she's got tattoos and all like things that you wouldn't expect when we looked at the tapestries at McGill. Completely different idea of tapestry. And so this is her teenage diary. This is like one of those marble composition books opened up. And she's really weaving. She's working through trauma. She had a traumatic childhood. Her mother was a victim of domestic abuse. And she is weaving as a way of healing. And you can see as a young teenager, she's making a reference on the upper left to Nan Goldin, the famous artist, her ballad of sexual dependency. It was a photojournal that is like one of the most important works of the late 80s. And also a thing to notice, first of all, this is very, very skilled and hard to do. And notice the beautiful how she's elevated her journal with a gold thread, which is not like glistening the way it would be if you saw it in person on the sides of the pages. The second tapestry in the show is by Helen Ascoli. Helen is Guatemalan, but she lives in Wisconsin. She teaches fiber arts at an art school there. And Helen works on the backstrap loom. The backstrap loom is one of the more ancient looms, and is still very popular in Central and South America. So you look at this and you really think about Central America. I'm showing you an example of a backstrap loom, and you can see that it's strapped around the back of the weaver, and then one end and the other end, I suppose, is tied to a tree in this image. And when you're weaving on the backstrap loom, your whole body is engaged in the act of weaving. And so the text in this work is actually plucked out of the warp, and it says, which I think is a very difficult thing to do. And it says in Spanish, in los hilos encontré, in the threads, I found it, it was found. And it's an inversion of what we would think, because we would think you made it with the threads, but she's saying the act of weaving is a collaboration between the loom and the artist. This is by Basira Khan. Basira is not a fiber or textile artist. Basira is a conceptual artist. This is a prayer rug. And Basira is Muslim American. Both her parents immigrated to outside of Dallas, Texas, and she was born in Texas. She grew up a Muslim American, and her work is about about being a Muslim American and brown skin and being on the margins. And so the work is actually, Basira made a print, and the print got sent to Kashmir, India, where artisans embroidered it and got sent back here. And it's from a series of prayer rugs. They're called psychedelic prayer rugs. The text, I am a body, is, as I said, it's dealing with skin color and identity. And the color is interesting because it's based on Basira doing a skin match to buy a concealer, and it was totally off. Like African Americans haven't been able to find the right colors in makeup. It's the same with Muslims. And the text is an appropriation from the civil rights movement. This is a picture from the sanitation worker strike in 1968 in Memphis. And this placard, I am a man, has been appropriated a lot lately in American art. And so Basira is using it as well. And this is the final work on our show. This is the oldest work. It's from 1963. It's by Stephen Antonakis, who is no longer alive. He was a neon artist, but made these beautiful minimalist neons, but early in his career in the 60s, think about Robert Rauschenberg and found objects. And this is a pillow. This is a real pillow, and it's hard to see the dimensionality in the slide, but he has some like wax or some material on it that hardened it. And then the word dream is actually created by, those are nails, the backs are nails. So you have this contrast between sleep and the softness of the pillow with this really harsh reality of the nails coming through. It was a very turbulent time in the 60s, and also a difficult time in his early career. And I think this is all coming through. So that is the end of the slide presentation. And I made it through, so we have time for questions. Whew.
Well, thank you so much, Debbie. We'll open it up for questions to everyone, and I will voice them on your behalf. But I think I might throw the microphone back to Wendy if you want to get us going with an initial question. And that would be great. And we do have some in the crowd, and I've got some queued up. So I think we'll definitely fill up our time here. But Wendy, if you'd like.
So I'm going to ask Debbie, I'm going to give you one of my favorite questions that I give to curators after exhibitions. What was the surprise, or were there surprises along the way as you were putting together this show?
Well, yeah, there were surprises. I wonder, let me see if you can still see my screen, right?
Yeah.
So one of the surprises, there were all these grids that appeared because here's my line. Everything had if you look at this row, right? Even sort of, well, the quilt you could think of as a grid, but the Gada Mare is a grid, the Helena Scoli, the diary, there's a grid in the diary, the pattern in the tea towel. And I guess, you know, the loom is a grid. So that was interesting. And then, yeah, when you get the works, like you know, you live with them and you start to learn things from them. And, you know, just like the idea of I sob, it burns, it stings, I sob. And like halfway through the show, I'm like, oh, it's also about losing her mother. So, and then artists came in and taught me things. And the most exciting thing was word got out to the weaving community, but sort of only like the last week of the show. And all these weavers came in and they started talking to me about, because I am not a fiber artist, and they started teaching me really about the making of these works. So a lot of discovery.
There's a number of comments in the chat. One about throughout your talk, responding to items, suggestions of books that we should all read, comments on the works themselves and complementary works. And I can send all of this chat to you afterwards. And
okay,
it's been
great.
fascinating and fun to have as a side conversation during your talk. One of them it was just a thank you for showing the back of the quilts and showing the labor of the work that's involved. And on that note, a follow-up question. You mentioned the name of one of the quilters. I think it was the second quilt that you spoke of, the second.
Robert Bemis.
Robert
Bemis. He lives, I think, in Troy, New York, upstate.
Yes,
not
it's
far from Montreal.
Absolutely beautiful work.
It's exquisite.
Yes, and I noticed the first quilt that you showed, you can see on what is now the front of the artist's work, which was the back of the quilt, you can see the quilting has made it almost a palimpsest. You can see the text through from one side to the other, which is just beautiful. So thank you from the crowd and from me for showing such beautiful work and acknowledging the people that go into making these projects. There was a follow-up question on the same topic of the people that go into producing them regarding Boetti's work. You showed a photo of the women involved in production. Were they ever identified, or did they remain unknown?
There's actually, you know, I was also wondering about this when I first learned about Boetti. Was he exploiting the women? But he was actually giving them a livelihood. And there's this image comes from a book. You can see the book, Boetti by Afghan people. And there was this whole book made about these women. A photojournalist, I think it must have been Randy Malkin Steinberger, actually got to know the woman, and he was never able to meet them because of Muslim law, which is interesting. He went through the husbands. He had to deal with the husbands.
Okay. And I noted as well in your comments that there's a number of female artists, and traditionally that has been the domain of women. But you also included works by a number of male artists and people of different races, ethnic origins, and traditions. Can you tell me a little bit more about your selection processes and your criteria, I guess? Of course, text is the one, but you have artists from all over.
No, I'm glad you noticed, or whoever noticed, because yes, that was a goal, to be very, well, first to represent as many different kinds of people. And I love the idea of showing that men are doing this work now too. And I wanted to have different languages. And I mean, I was limited because the gallery is small budget. I couldn't borrow from all over the place, but it was really a priority to make it very, very diverse.
Another follow-up question, perhaps you learned from the weavers. You mentioned that a number of them came in towards the end of the show. One question comes in from the crowd, from Susan. What would be the role of computerized looms, especially in the piece that you mentioned and showed by Erin Riley with the journal pages?
Computerized loom. Well, this is no computerized looms, handmade, old-fashioned. And I said, it's for her, it's therapeutic. Like Erin needs to weave. It keeps her going. And I met her. She came to see we had many chances to speak, and she is weaving all the time. It's like super time consuming. So everything here, I think everything in the show is handmade.
Yes, and I can relate and I understand the time required, which makes these works so extraordinary. I have set up a backstrap loom and made projects on it myself, and it's the setup time for a backstrap loom is perhaps less than a floor mounted loom, but it's always, always time consuming. There's a lovely discussion happening about computerized looms now in the chat. Another question about weaving once again. Some of the tapestries, Wendy, that you mentioned in your comments as well, that would have been designed and then sent out to a weaver for construction. What would be the standard practice? Would the weaver then be credited? Is it acknowledged on the card, or is it purely mainly the work of the designer and artist that gets featured, or are they posted as collaborations?
For our works at McGill, we don't have the names of the people who wove them. Sometimes we might have the name of the company that wove them. They're big companies that did this. You know, and I think Debbie's talk brings up a whole other way that we're thinking about works of art that are done collaboratively. You know, we credit Roy Lichtenstein for the design, but that what you see is actually done by another person. So I think this is one of the ways we are changing how we are thinking about works of art. And we're talking, since this is a book club, I have a great book about 19th century American art called Anonymous Was a Woman, because they were anonymous. They were making, you know, samplers and many things without a name.
On that topic, we did have a number of comments from the crowd with book suggestions, references to books to read, novels on that feature textile artists, one about the Lady and the Unicorn. Does that ring any bells with the two of you? Anyway, thank you to everyone in the crowd who has chimed in with suggestions of reading and further information about these works. It's really wonderful. One person even posted a photo of the sampler that her grandmother made, which is quite impressive. And I can I can show it to everyone with your permission. As a nice, there it is. This is the sampler was it Giovanna? Thank you for sharing with the group here. One final question from Nathalie, and then we'll give thanks and close out this really fascinating conversation. But she wanted to know, Debbie, what were some of the memorable comments of people who came in to this exhibition? Can you recall some key takeaways and comments of people reacting to these works?
Well, I mean, I guess for me, the greatest thrill was when the weavers thanked me there, because they don't get to see shows like this a lot. And so the gratitude and the fact that they liked the show is like, phew. And you know, the fact that so this was a gallery, right? The works were for sale and people bought the works. So that was very flattering, but I'm not remembering any other comments that, I don't know.
Well, we have a few in the chat today, and maybe I'll close with one of those. Thank you so much for a wonderful presentation from a weaver in Northwestern BC who's joining us. So thanks to all of you on that note for tuning in from wherever you are. Thank you for your lively engagement in the chat. We have some things to explore. The Quebec tradition of Catalan weaving, for instance, which apparently has a lot in common with the Japanese piece that you showed at the beginning, Wendy. So we have some avenues for exploration. We'll send follow-up links and a link to the recording for those who weren't able to join us in person. I'll say an enormous thank you to Debbie and to Wendy for sharing these works and such an interesting tour through text and textile with us today. Our next event, I'll just put up on the screen briefly. That's it for January. Our next event is in February. We'll be hearing from Professor Gwendolyn at JT and on the topic of 1919, further back in history, the year of the Black Messiah. That's our next meeting. And I want to say once again, thank you to all for joining us and to our sponsors and donors who make these events possible. This was a lot of fun. As a person who loves fiber arts, it's just great to hear about the history, the context, and the amazing work that modern and contemporary artists are doing. So once again, an enormous thank you from me and a very large round of Zoom applause for such an interesting topic. Thank you and have a great afternoon, everyone.